Thank you, Maxine. How is my mic working? Are you able to hear me through the sound system? Okay, great. Well, I see some familiar faces out there, and it's so reassuring and wonderful, and I'm just delighted to be here with you today and share some of my own personal excitement about this rephotography project. This work was originally created in 1929, as you know, and in some ways it could be argued that it has finally reached its full fruition here today in the museum. And it is a long journey that it has taken. There have been many baton carriers on that journey, and of course the Lindberghs and the Earl Morris and Alfred Kidder were the original ones to pick up the baton, and it has come through the museum and the Laboratory of Anthropology, the Palace of the Governors, the archives, and then Eric Berg, historian, began to uncover the story. And around that same time, Bill Doley, the CEO of Archaeology Southwest, became aware of the entirety of the work of the Lindberghs from this area and got to thinking, because we were at that time working on a large aerial photography project of our own that opened at the Albuquerque Museum in 2004 called From Above, Images of a Storied Land. And it was in that context that all of us began to think about, what if we went out and created modern versions of each of those, the best of the Lindbergh images. And that's where I came into play. My part was the contemporary aerial photographer. And I'll tell you more later in the program about why I was well suited to that role. But I would like to make just a few acknowledgments along the way. There were some early funders of the project through what was then the Center for Desert Archaeology, Priscilla and William Robinson, and a couple of foundations, family foundations down in Tucson that actually paid for the field work for me to begin going out and photographing. And then here at the museum, there have been numerous contributors as well, as including the Scanlon Family Foundation. And we're all of us, the project team members, grateful for that support because that is how this work truly came into being. What I would like to do is share with you a brief synopsis of the Lindbergh story as it relates to why these images are important and how they were made at the time, the lives that this work fit into. Absolutely fascinating. And the more you learn about it, I think the more the photographs mean. And that's my intention today, is to bring to life a bit of the story of the Lindberghs so that you can fully appreciate what those images mean in the gallery there today. And then to tell a little bit of my own story as well. And I'll begin now with my images that I have prepared. This is Janelle Weekly of the Arizona State Museum looking at one of the original Lindbergh negatives, evaluating it, preparing it for scanning. This is the scanner. She and a number of other people got together in 2007 to digitize these negatives. There's one right there, and she's processing it on the computer to protect them forever and ever as a digital file so that the nitrocellulose negatives could be safely stored away in deep cold storage. That's the only way to protect them for long-term keeping. Otherwise, they just slowly disintegrate over the years. That is, if they don't catch fire. Oh, and by the way, I should mention too, that's Linda Pearson, the red sweater there, processing the contact prints that were also part of the archives at the Palace of the Governors. Beautiful contact black and white images with pencil handwriting on the back, Alfred Kidder's, Charles Lindbergh's. What a delight to handle those. And Linda was processing those through the system as well. So let's begin with the Lindberghs. You know, you look at these old black and white photos from so long ago and your eyes can just kind of glaze over. But as you learn what really was behind the true life of these folks and what they accomplished, it is astounding. Charles Lindbergh was born right at the turn of the century, 1902. He was the only child of his mother, Elizabeth Land. She was unusually well educated for her day. She had a degree in chemistry from the University of Michigan, and she went on to teach school and college later in Charles's life. but she doted on him because he was her only child. And her father was a well-known dentist. In fact, he's been tagged with the line, father of porcelain dentistry. And he was a favorite of young Charles. In fact, he loved to hang out in his grandfather's laboratory where he could explore all kinds of processes and devices and containers and contraptions. And he claims that he learned his appreciation for science and technology through his mother's father, Dr. Land. Charles' father was a very accomplished man. He was an attorney. He became a representative to Congress for the state of Minnesota. His father, here I am. But his father was also an attorney, and his father, that would be Charles's grandfather, was a member of the Swedish Parliament and eventually moved the whole family to Minnesota. They were immigrants. And so Charles obviously did not follow in that family tradition of being a lawyer, but he learned an awful lot from his father, including aspects of character and a really strong, hard work ethic. But the price for some of that was that his father was rarely home. And they moved around a lot. Charles went to 11 different schools during his boyhood, and it was a rough life on the home front from that perspective. His father built a house on bluffs above the upper Mississippi River in Little Falls, Minnesota. This is the house. Charles had a bedroom with, it was actually a screened-in porch, and he just said, "I'll take that, that's mine." And he could hear the Mississippi River down below. He could see the wind blowing through the trees outside. He really had a connection and attachment to nature from the very earliest days. He spent a lot of time alone. He only had 2 half-sisters, and they were much older than he was, and his father was gone. His mother was often occupied with community affairs, and so he had to content himself being alone for a lot of his childhood, and of course, it shaped his character, and that was one of the things that he had been known for all the way through his lifetime. He had the Mississippi River as his playground. There were rapids near the house at that time. Now there's a dam there and it's a lake and so forth. But at that time, he could go down and just while away endless childhood hours around the river and also working on the farm that his parents had. He wasn't much of a student. He tried, by his 3rd semester at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, he was asked to leave because he just was not achieving academically. And he knew it. He admitted, "My mind wanders, I'm restless, I want to be out doing things, school just isn't my gig." And so he decided to go to flight school. And at that time, flight school was just a rattle trap operation in a barn or somewhere, and he showed up with a little bit of money, and they wouldn't give him flying lessons. All they did was put him to work, helping with maintaining the airplanes and conducting barnstorming gigs. You notice the dog there? I can't say for sure whether that's his dog, but later on when he became a barnstormer pilot, he had a dog of his own that went with him on his trips, and as part of his performance to attract the community in for business, he would strap the dog, you can see the harness there, and put it on a rubber mat out on the wing and fly around with the dog sitting out on the wing just to get people to come and take part. And you know what? His first time to fly as the pilot, his first solo, he did it himself without any instruction. He figured it out watching other pilots fly. He said, "Dad, I'm going to buy an airplane. Can you help me out?" His dad helped him out with some cash, and this is his first airplane. He bought an airplane, and then he flew it, first time. And he had a few rough periods, but he was really sharp, needless to say, and he figured it out and went on to become a barnstorming pilot. This was, around 20 years of age or so. And out on the road as a barnstormer, I can't say which one of those is Charles, probably that one, but one of them is for sure. But just look at this. There's a bicycle in the flying wires there for ground transportation when they would land, because they would just fly from community to community, round up locals. This is just a local person, unknown identity. And to save money, they would often sleep under the wing and just make their camp right there at the airplane in somebody's farm field. What a life. he got into parachuting because parachuting was one of the things that they did to attract the community in to see what was going on with the airplane so they could get business for their barnstorming. And he had a few really close calls with parachutes. Turns out his first one was kind of self-induced during instruction in parachuting, but he also worked in a parachute factory, and he ended up getting his own parachute as payment for that. Times were really lean in those days, and so he ended up with a parachute rather than money. But it went on, you know, he was eventually in, well, I'll tell you a couple stories about the parachute now as we go on here. First, though, with the airplane that his father helped him buy, he eventually showed up to start flying his father around the state of Minnesota when he wanted to run for U.S. Senate from Minnesota. And how embarrassing that he crashed on takeoff after one of the campaign visits. Nobody was hurt, just some pride. The airplane got fixed, and it was a kind of a non-event in the end, but awkward. But he got involved in the airmail business then. He realized barnstorming was a very irregular, unstable way to make a living, and that this was kind of the future of the aviation business. And this is him loading the, whoops, I'm going to go back here. That's Charles there. Bags of mail. They loaded them in the front seat of the two-seat tandem configuration biplane. This was the inaugural run of airmail service between St. Louis and Chicago. And that's what he ended up flying. It was a 3-hour run. And as a foreshadowing of his flight across the Atlantic, notice that he's sitting in the rear cockpit. The front cockpit is loaded with mail bags, and he got used to not being able to see out the front of the airplane from flying the mail. But it was just fraught with danger to a degree that we can't even imagine these days. This is the results of a crash. It's nighttime, obviously. What happened was he got to his destination, and it was fogged in, and there was no way for him to get down. Instrument flying, instrument landing systems, of course, did not exist at that time. And so he flew around above the clouds until the plane ran out of gas, aimed it somewhere that he hoped was safe, and jumped out with his parachute. And that's how he got down. That happened at least twice. It was almost a routine way of handling very difficult weather situations in the early days of the U.S. mail. That is Slim Lindbergh right there. And now steps into the picture this fellow, Raymond Ortigue. And he had French ancestry. He owned a couple of very successful hotels in New York City. And he was possessed of a vision of the future of aviation. He thought that that's where the future lay, was ahead in aviation. And so he created the Ortigue Prize, $25,000 to the first person who could fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris, or apparently from Paris to New York, whichever way would work. That prize was on the table from 1919 until Charles actually did it in 1927. And it's interesting that Charles wasn't even in college yet when this guy had this idea and created this prize money. By the way, $25,000 then, worth about $250,000 now. That's the kind of money we're talking about. And nobody got serious about trying to do that until 1926 into 1927. It's because of this thing, the Wright Whirlwind engine. Talk about technology breakthroughs. This was the one element that was missing in the combination of factors that were necessary to allow someone to actually succeed in flying across that much open water. The reliability of this engine, the power, and how much power it produced in relation to how much it weighed. The older airplane engines were extremely heavy for the amount of horsepower that they put out. This thing had a very elegant power-to-weight ratio. It was designed expressly for this purpose, and it was 9 cylinders, radial configuration, produced 223 horsepower, and all of this external mechanism around here, normally on aircraft engines prior, had to be manually lubricated by pilots or mechanics after every flight. And part of the development of this high-tech breakthrough was that it could lubricate itself automatically in flight. And it was designed to run continuously without shutting down for 40 hours. Well, how long did it take Lindbergh to fly to Paris? 33 hours and 30 minutes. The engine held up. And as a pilot, I know how much that means. And so there it is. It started, in effect, to fuel all of these attempts to fly across the Atlantic. And he put it on his specially designed Ryan airplane. There he is working on the Wright Whirlwind J5 engine that was on the Spirit of St. Louis. And by the way, he's 25 years old in this picture. One of the attempts that did not make it, because these guys got all the press. Lindbergh himself was an underdog, and a nobody. Nobody knew him, nobody followed him, until he brought his Spirit of St. Louis from St. Louis on the final leg to New York, where he planned to stage his attempt across the Atlantic. He broke a world record flying that distance, and he started to get some attention at that point. And he had a hangar at the Roosevelt Field where he was making final preparations on the airplane to go. But so did a lot of other people. There were a number of different operations, including this big tri-motor plane built by Sikorsky for a World War I French ace named René Fonck, who planned to do it in style. He was going to have a crew of 4 men, including himself, 3 engines, extra fuel tanks. He had carpet, he had leather seats. It was just going to be a French production. It was wonderful, and it would have been spectacular, but the auxiliary landing gear that it's not visible in this photograph, it's not on the plane now, but they put on extra landing gear at various places around the plane to hold up the extra weight of all the extra fuel that they were going to have to carry to feed those 3 engines going across the Atlantic. And as they were taking off, one of the auxiliary wheels broke off, and then the plane started to kind of wobble, and they lost a little bit of control, but they kept going. They just gunned the engines. But then something in the back broke off, and its tail started to drag in the dirt. It was just a dirt track. And they got all the way to the end of the runway, and they were not quite at flying speed. Way too much momentum to stop. They had no brakes. And it went down over the edge. All the spectators were there watching. It disappeared over an embankment at the end. And about 2 seconds later, just this huge, just like in the movies, a huge orange fireball came up and a huge plume of black smoke up into the sky. 2 men were incinerated in the crash. Not René, he made it out okay, but that was a textbook case of how not to do this. And Charles was paying attention. Here's another failed attempt. This is the Oiseau Blanc. This was an attempt to go from France, from Paris, to New York by another French World War I ace. And they did not do their weather checking very well, and they flew off into the North Atlantic with a huge storm in force in the western part of the ocean, and they were never heard or seen from again. They were gone, just disappeared. Charles was very serious about all of this, and he had some design and engineering skills, and he had a lot of experience, perhaps some of the best and most in the world at that time, flying in actual harsh conditions. He said something to the effect that after all of my hours of flying the mail on the routes that I did in the horrible weather conditions and parachute landing of airplanes and making forced landings when the engine quit, crossing the Atlantic was child's play. If he prepared properly, he felt he could pull that off. He was not at all daunted by the challenges of the task. And he helped design the aircraft, which was actually a modification of an existing airplane, an existing mail plane. And they modified it in several ways. For one thing, they put in an extra fuel tank. This is the key thing there. That particular tank was 209 gallons of gasoline sitting immediately, a huge wall in front of the pilot. No way to see out front, and a lot of extra weight. In fact, that's the cockpit. Just look at all the plumbing in here, and this is the back of the fuel tank right here. I mean, that's what Charles was looking at the whole way across. All he could do was look out the side window to get an idea of where he was going. They did have a periscope, I think it was right there in the panel, but it wasn't clear whether he ever actually used it or not, but it was actually from a submarine. But they had to add 5 feet onto the design specification of the wingspan, 5 feet on each side, so 10 extra feet of wing to carry all that weight of all that fuel that he needed, a total of 450 gallons of gasoline to go across the Atlantic. Here he is taking off from his kind of home field of St. Louis, Lambert Field, after the final preparations there to go to New York City, where he was actually going to stage the Atlantic crossing from. Well, he made it, obviously, and that's the big news of the century. He was just thronged in Paris, and it's just kind of like everything you can imagine about something like that is what happened. The New York Times devoted its first 4 pages, every single column inch, to the success of Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. It is just hard to overstate the significance of this event to the world when the word got around that he actually did, because the world at that point had heard so many stories about spectacular failures, people who did not make it, and here is this young, relatively unknown, 25-year-old man from Minnesota, 6'3", blonde. I mean, he just seemed like an all-American character, and he pretty much pulled it off by himself, by organizing, of course, the resources that he needed to do it. He didn't do it alone. There were many people working with him and for him, but he had the vision, and his vision was a sleek, lean monoplane, 1 engine, nothing extra. He didn't even carry any mail across the ocean after being an airmail pilot for all those years, because the weight, everything was about paring it down. He knew what the essential issues were for pulling this off technically, and that attention to detail and that depth of knowledge is what underlay his actual success in the mission. Well, he toured Europe for a little while, basking in the glow. Of course, everybody wanted to see Charles Lindbergh. He flew across the English Channel. Here he is landing at Croydon Field outside of London. There were more people here for this landing than there were at his original landing in Le Bourget in Paris. And he actually wasn't able to land for a while because 150,000 people had crowded onto the field, and they couldn't get enough clear space to touch the airplane down safely for a while. And he hobnobbed. I mean, this is Queen Elizabeth on his right, King of Belgium on his left. They were both really into aviation, aviators themselves. They personally showed him some of the aircraft that Belgium had and that England had at the time. I mean, he was treated royally by royalty, no exaggeration. And this was even before he got back to America. But every public appearance that he would make, I love this, a classic acoustic bullhorn here to address the crowds. That's what he would do. And he came across consistently as very straightforward, down to earth, plain spoken, said what he had to say, and he was done. He did not, make a big deal out of it. He said that what good is celebrity if you don't have a message? And part of his life was devoted to developing that message. And of course, his message was already well honed by the time he even made it to this point, because his message was in his mission. It's what he did. And he went on to live that out the rest of his entire lifetime. But when he came back home to the United States, this is what the New York harbor looked like. And an armada, just an unprecedented armada to greet him, and estimated 4.3 million people in Manhattan to come out and escort him. Ticker tape, like a true blizzard, visibility almost zero in the streets. It was just unbelievable. And of course, once that happened, he just kicked into a whole new level of living. Here he is with Harry Guggenheim, son of Daniel Guggenheim, the philanthropist. And Daniel Guggenheim founded a fund that Charles later said was probably the most critical factor in the advance of commercial aviation in the United States. And it was simply a foundation for the promotion of aeronautical science. But he was personal close friends with his son, Harry Guggenheim. And this goes on to play a pretty important role downstream as we go through. But they flew together. Harry had his own airplane. They just loved bopping around together. And Harry, in fact, helped to fund Charles's tour of the United States. When he got back, he was a hero. Every community in the United States wanted a piece of him, and everybody involved thought, why not? So he went out on a 3-month-long tour, 22,000 miles, covered all 48 states, the lower 48 states, visited each one, and the shtick for that tour was that he would land at his predetermined, pre-chosen destination at 2 o'clock exactly in the afternoon at every destination. And he made it in every state except Maine because of fog. And that was part of what he was doing, was showing that aviation was reliable. It was safe, and he could be somewhere when he said he was going to be there. He would make good on it. And so this zigzaggy line here all across the United States is the route of his tour within 3 months after crossing the Atlantic. This is, by the way, his route across the Atlantic, a great circle route. And the other lines on here are some other later tours that he did, and then Anne later. But as you will learn and probably already know, he opened up much of the world for commercial airline travel by these tours that he would make with various sponsorship. And Harry Guggenheim was often a major backer of these tours. So here he is flying from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Salt Lake City. This is the real spirit of St. Louis. It is Charles Lindbergh. He made the grand United States tour, flying across the Rockies. Here he is over the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest, skimming the waters of Lake Yellowstone. A little bit later on his Latin American tour over the Panama Canal. And I have this picture of him receiving the award from Calvin Coolidge, President Coolidge here. It's the National Geographic Society Award, not because of the award, but because of what comes next. Calvin Coolidge was a classmate of Dwight Morrow at Amherst College. And Dwight Morrow had achieved very great heights at the J.P. Morgan Company as an attorney. And Calvin Coolidge had watched him ascend in the financing world, that he kept his character and his integrity intact at a time when a lot of people at that level had those were in question. And he plucked him for the ambassadorship of the United States to Mexico. So Calvin Coolidge chose Dwight Morrow to be the United States ambassador to Mexico, and when Dwight Morrow called and asked for Charles Lindbergh to come and visit Mexico City as a special tour to kind of help difficult relations with Mexico at the time, here's what we have. President Calles, Dwight Morrow, the ambassador, E. Lindbergh. And there they are in Mexico City. And it was during that visit in December of 1927 that he met the Morrow's second daughter, Anne. And she was in Smith College at the time. And she was very quiet and reserved compared to her older, more flamboyant, and much more popular sister. In fact, for a long time, here they are on kind of a date. They're out, this is before they were married. They tried to pull this off secretly as much as possible because Charles was just hounded by both reporters and the general public everywhere he went. Everybody knew what he looked like and could recognize him on the street like a movie star. And so it was very difficult for them to get out at all. And a lot of the press at the time had him going out with the Morrow's older daughter, a much more public and extroverted and obvious choice for this hero of the century. But there was some real chemistry, some real magic between Charles and Anne. And it didn't take them long to realize, I think less than a year and a half until they actually were married. And one of the ways that they spent their time together was flying. She loved flying. Of course, Charles did. He always had an airplane. And that would be what they would do for a date. And she just took it all right in stride. She personally really liked it, they found. And it was a great way to be literally above it all and leave it all behind. I mean, all the crowds, all the harassment, gone. So they got married in a private, secret ceremony, only 22 people in attendance, in the living room of her parents' home in Englewood, New Jersey. And then they slipped away in his private cruiser boat and went up to New England for their honeymoon. This picture was taken of Anne on their honeymoon in New England. Again, desperately trying to escape the crowds and have some sort of decent private life. And this was in June of 27, so this is only 2 months before the photographs in the gallery were made. That's how newlywed they were at the time they were out here in the Southwest doing this work that we see. Well, the Curtiss Airplane Factory gave Charles a special edition of their Curtiss Falcon biplane. And this is the airplane, this is the actual airplane that the Lindberghs flew around the country in, and that they visited Pecos and Albuquerque and Winslow and Canyon de Chelly and Chaco Canyon. This is the machine. This is what they used. And of course, immediately, Charles started teaching Anne to fly. It took a few years for her to actually get her pilot's license because they were just so busy. But he was a very serious instructor. She was a very serious student. They both took it deeply to heart, and sometimes that she would stay up until late at night until she just fell asleep over the charts and over the tables that she was working on to learn. It was a much more difficult task at that time to learn to fly than it is today. And this airplane was used by them to travel all around the country. They did all kinds of surveys and exploration of routes together in this plane, and here they are. I think this was before they were married. And can you imagine, wearing a dress and getting in and out of an airplane like that? What a trooper. But all that flying, well, not all of it, but a lot of the flying around that they did, including being out here, to be able to take these photographs, was to open up, pioneer the operation of this, the first commercial airline transcontinental trimotor in the United States. Charles was hired as a technical advisor. He was chairman of the technical committee of the Transcontinental Air Transport Company, and he was paid good money to fly around and lend his expertise to all the questions facing a startup business of this magnitude, including out here in the West, actually creating airports almost out of nothing. Because back east there was much more population, much more activity, much more historical patterns of aircraft use. Out here in the Southwest, virtually none. And so he had to basically take it from the ground up. And so flying around in that biplane to explore sources of fuel and safest routes across the terrain and so forth, all so that people could get into this airplane, sit back in their leather chairs, and be served cookies and tea as they flew along just above the clouds. So the archaeology comes in when, during one of his earlier surveys in Latin America, he flew home across the Yucatan Peninsula, and he saw ruins, and it intrigued him, and he photographed. He apparently was somewhat of a photographer, even though we can't find much information about the details of that, for example, what kind of camera or film he used. But his photographs of Chichen Itza down in the Yucatan are still considered to be extremely valuable for reference and kind of their remote sensing value. But what happened was a little bit of a spark went off inside Charles when he saw these ancient structures and became intrigued about what was going on there, like many others of us who have had that experience. And he went to the Smithsonian Institution, and that led to the Carnegie Institution. You can read all the details of this in the catalog. Eric has a wonderful essay that just lays it all out as a great story. But it resulted him being in him being put in touch with Alfred Kidder, who basically gave him the short list of what to look for here in the Southwest and go photograph. And as it turned out, things got really intense for them. The airline was about to start up. They left New York to get to Los Angeles to be there for the inauguration, so Charles himself could actually fly the first commercial airline flight from Los Angeles to Kingman. But on the way, and then somewhat after that, because they actually had 2 visits out here, they actually did visit these places. They were on the ground at Pecos. They were on the ground at Canyon de Chelly. And here's a rare photo of them overlooking Canyon de Chelly, unidentified person in the foreground. This is not a Lindbergh photograph. This was taken by someone in the Earl Morris camp. Earl Morris, an archaeologist, was actively excavating in Canyon de Chelly when they visited. And because of the chronology of their visit and how they were able to work it out, on their second visit, they were actually able to deliver prints, that they had, of photographs that they had taken during their previous visit, which was by air, so that they could show the guys on the ground the beauty and the spectacle of the canyon from the air, including photographs of the archaeology. And as they were flying around Canyon de Chelly, they found ruins just below the rim that they felt were probably undiscovered. And here Charles is, I believe this is correct, looking at an image that they brought with them that they had taken on their previous visit to try to, because they wanted to go visit this ruin that they had found from the air. And a newsletter from the Carnegie Institution later said that Charles and Anne, who actually did make it into the ruin, climbed down and got to the cliff dwelling, were the first white people to visit that ruin. I can't vouch for the accuracy of that, but that's what the claim was. Anne was 23 years old. And this is a shot. Here's the wing of the Curtiss Falcon biplane, and the ruin is right in here. It's now known as the Beehive Ruin. That's a shot we did not replicate for the show. You can probably see why, but nevertheless, it's an interesting little tidbit of history there. And of course, their life just got bigger and bigger after this. The years went by. It's just so jam-packed with activities of all kind. Here they are. Anne is going for a glider ride. She became the first woman to ever hold a first-class glider pilot license in the United States. Serious pilot in her own right. They had the Lockheed Company build a special seaplane for them, and here they're standing in front of it. They flew this tens of thousands of miles, almost all around the world, exploring transoceanic routes for Pan American Airways. He was on a retainer for Pan American as well as TWA. And Anne was, as in Charles' words, a crew member. She worked as hard as he did. She often flew. She could fly from her back seat of that Lockheed Orion seaplane when she didn't need to see out the front, like over the middle of the ocean. She handled all the radio communications. She knew the Morse code. She handled the navigation frequently. And all of those things were much more challenging technically than they are today. So she was all about it. I mean, she was into it personally. She was into being a team member. They worked together as a team to an impressive degree of efficiency. And they were never without an airplane. This is later in the 1930s. They had a special monoplane built for them. They flew this to Europe. They lived in Europe. They flew this all around Europe. They flew over the Alps. They flew into Asia. They went to India in this airplane. They flew over the Himalayas. Just, even in today's world, it's pretty mind-blowing what they did just as a couple. And the same year that Charles was out here doing the photography that you see, he learned about the work of Robert Goddard. That's Robert Goddard. That's Harry Guggenheim. He learned what Goddard was up to. He went to Harry Guggenheim, to Daniel Guggenheim, and said, look, if we ever go above the sky, we're going to need something other than wings and propellers. How about rockets? Would you be interested in helping to develop the next phase of propulsion? And it was kind of fits and starts, but it happened. The Guggenheims funded Robert Goddard to come from little old Worcester, Massachusetts, out here to Roswell, New Mexico, which is where the meteorologist told him he would have the best conditions for his rocket experiments. And thus was Charles Lindbergh, at the age of, 27, critically involved in the beginning of the space era. Unbelievable. And so Apollo 11, launching for the first walk on the moon in 1969, this is it, the launch, Charles was there with Robert Goddard. And he wrote later, he said, now I'm here with Robert Goddard, and is the launch... Robert was the dreamer, the launch was the dream. Now the launch is the reality. Are we the dream? And this was the musings of a 67-year-old man. This was taken shortly before he died. He died at about 72, I think it was. He became really interested in conservation and humanitarian causes in his later years. So did Anne. There was a value system that they both shared together, and they both had their independent activities in that area. Many of you know Anne as a writer, and her writings were very instrumental in some of the early developments of the environmental movement. And he died at their beloved home in Maui in 1974. Now, a little bit about me. In 1969, I was launching model rockets, thinking that someday I would maybe fly in space. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. Nobody in my family was had anything to do with aviation, but I really got possessed. And by age 14, I had built a bat glider, really, really early version of a hang glider from plans out of bamboo and plastic. Never got it to fly, but boy, did I hope. And then at age 15, I actually started taking flying lessons. My parents said, yeah, sure, you got to pay for it yourself, but go for it. So I did. And I actually was flying planes before I was driving cars. And it went on to a career as a professional pilot. Here I am with then President Peterson Za in front of one of the Navajo Nation King Airs. That's what I do today still, is fly for the Navajo Nation government. And interestingly enough, after all these years, Peterson Za is now back on as an executive staff member on the new president of the Navajo Nation, Russell Begay. And this is one of the Navajo Nation airplanes that I fly near the Red Rocks, north of Window Rock, which is where our flight department is based. And this was the flight department at the time that I started working for the Navajos back in the 80s. And this single-engine plane here in the foreground was what I started my aerial photography in, because there was a window, you can't see it, but it was right there by the pilot. And you could open the window and stick your lens out so you weren't shooting through plexiglass. And I waited for flights where I didn't have any passengers on board, and I would bank the plane up into knife edge flight, and I would shoot my camera straight down or out, whatever the situation called for. And very, very slowly, borrowing a little time from my employer, I was able to develop my aerial photography skills. And we just flew all over the place. I loved the variety of the flying, into dirt strips like this. Almost bush flying on the Navajo Nation back in those days. These days, we don't have any small planes like that anymore. It's all, plush, pressurized, turboprop executive transport, but like that. And now that we've gone to an all King Air fleet, and that happened actually back in 1990, so it's been a long time. This was the world that I was in for most of the flight, way up above the land, couldn't really get access to it photographically. Very frustrating, because I had really tasted the juice of what it is creatively to work from the sky with a camera. And so realizing all my limitations as a pilot, this is the cockpit, it's like being inside a submarine compared to what I was dreaming about, which was more of this kind of thing where your toes are your only obstruction to vision. This was taken in Hawaii, by the way. That's what I yearned for. That's what I really wanted, both as a pilot and also as a photographer. And so with the landscape like this to work on, every day it was routine. I mean, this is where I spent my day at the office, so to speak. I decided to build this thing, and it would be my own personal transport into just those moments of photography that I was looking for. And I set to work building this thing in the tribal hangar. At that time, I lived in one of the mobile homes across the way there that the tribe had for non-Navajo employees. And so I could spend my evening hours, sometimes late into the night, working out. I'd never done anything like this before. I'm not a mechanic by nature, but I was, like Charles, very, very serious about the work once I learned what was important to me, and this was it. Holly, my wife, came into my life at that time. I was about halfway through building the airplane when I met Holly, and we really hit it off, and she's with me here today. So this picture goes way back, but here we're putting the covering on the upper surface of one of the wings of the aircraft. I purpose-built from scratch a special pod to fit on the airplane to carry all of my camera equipment with me. There I am resting my hands on it when it's finished. Notice how the engine is behind the wing. I'm sitting in the front. I eventually took this thing off. It just got in the way. And I had my ideal, which is just basically a seat in the sky. Here I am getting the coveted airworthiness certificate from the FAA inspector. Yes, it is a registered airplane. The FAA did have to inspect it. It's airworthy, all bright and shiny new, ready to go. And one of the key factors in this design choice was that the plane folds. So here you see me bringing it out of the trailer that I transported it all around the western United States and even down into Mexico. In fact, this photo was taken down in Mexico. And this was actually a horse race track that I was using for takeoff and landing. I mean, you can see some resonances, can you, between the way I'm operating and the way those guys did from the 1920s and 1930s? Often, here again, not at an airport, just a open playa kind of area in the desert, camping in the trailer, have everything I need right there. The plane doesn't fly very fast. That's why I trailer it around, because like to fly from here to Tucson would take longer than it would to actually just drive it. So to do this kind of work, I actually just trailered. And here I am camped beside a dirt road that I would use for takeoff and landing. And that's the purity of the experience over the Gulf of California here down in Mexico. Wing-mounted camera. You can see my gyro stabilizer there. Well, my work went on, and I got into National Geographic magazine by taking a workshop here in Santa Fe at one point, and the instructor was a National Geographic photographer, and he said, hey, let me show your stuff to the editor. And about a year and a half later, this was the result. And this changed my life. They had a nice feature in a different issue, this double-page spread of me at work. So from that time on, when I would talk to somebody and the subject was photography and maybe we were talking about a project or an assignment, all I would have to do is mention, yeah, oh yeah, you're that guy. Well, the time came eventually, for a lot of reasons I won't get into. I decided to upgrade my airplane from a home-built ultralight to this machine you see here. And here you can see the door is actually removed, and then that's how I shoot. I went on to go shooting digitally in this project, and here you see me with a friend, John Milligan. We're evaluating the use of a laptop in the cockpit to tether the camera so that I can instantly see the shot on my computer and compare it to the Lindbergh reprint that he's holding there. I eventually realized that didn't work out so well for a number of reasons, and now I do the work solo. I don't use a computer. I just use the screen on the back of the camera to evaluate how close my rephotograph is to the original. And this is what it looks like when I'm actually at work. This is over Pecos. You can see Pecos ruin down below here. And the door is open in this case, and you can't see it, but I have a gyro stabilizer on under the camera, and I'm just steering the plane with the control stick strapped to my knee so that I have both hands to hold and aim the camera. And it's all pretty simple. It's a very, very straightforward arrangement. I think Charles would be really impressed. I think one last shot here. Yeah, this is what it looks like from outside. It's not quite as pure as the ultralight. You know, the engine is in front, the propeller, you can see the propeller turning there. So I'm actually in a little extra wind because the propeller is a fan just pushing the wind back. I don't like that part so well, but everything else about it I like. It's a very efficient airplane. It travels very fast. I don't need a trailer, and it's a lot of fun. So to bring this to an end, I have a short multimedia presentation, no talking. It's just an experience for you to give you a taste of what my life is like up there, and then a look at some rephotographs that I made during the project that no one has ever seen. Today's the debut. And they're not identified. I decided not to put titles on. I decided not to talk over it because music, as you will see, is part of the experience. I want you to just get out of it what you can. Just understand that first you're seeing a Lindbergh, then you're seeing my contemporary rephotograph, and that's all you need to know. And if you want to know more, we can talk about it later. You know, in the Lindbergh project, the altitude was strictly determined by the altitude at which the Lindberghs worked, which was interestingly typically higher than what I personally work when I'm out. My own personal photography has to do with lower angles, lower altitudes, and long shadows, low light. And it's a very different environment than what the Lindberghs used. Lindberghs were typically 1,000 to 1,500 feet above the ground. I am often at 500 feet or lower. Just think of this as a guided dream.